everyone to one more of our up-close interviews. Today we are focusing again on the floating solar market, and I am here today with Molly Cox. She is the solar analyst at Wood Mackenzie Power Renewables. Molly, thank you very much for being with us today and welcome.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
Thank you, Molly. So let's just start a little bit about talking about the floating solar market in general. What an exciting market to be in. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of developments. So I wanted to ask you, what have you seen as main relevant past developments in floating solar, let's say in the past year, so since 2020 until now?
That's a great question and completely agree. It's a very exciting market to be in. I think, what's really interesting over the past year is a lot of the emerging floating solar markets that have really stepped onto the scene. I think in 2020, for example, we saw countries like Vietnam, Israel that had remarkable growth. Vietnam had about 150% year-over-year growth from 2019 to 2020. Israel saw floating solar capacity in 2020 that was about 7 times that of 2019. So there are a couple of drivers to this. Vietnam's potential for, hydropower resource, pairing with floating solar and sort of the co-location and hybridization. And then as well as with Israel, I think just generally the energy ministry's goal of the solar target of just under 16 gigawatts by 2030 is really driving this, along with high land costs and the kind of drooling process to attain land. So it's really remarkable to see these countries. Of course, the Asia Pac region is still leading the way, and definitely in 2020 we saw our fair share of project delays just related to COVID. But 2021 we're going to see huge growth this year, seeing about 106% increase because of those projects that were pushed from 2020 into 2021. So it's quite remarkable in that regard.
Okay, Molly, that's very interesting. And now for a second question for you. What would you say that are some of the most relevant, most prominent trends right now in the floating solar markets?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there are a lot of interesting trends. One I just want to start out with is just something I think that is interesting to pay attention to is just the growing average project size, which I think is important, especially as it relates to system costs and economies of scale factors, both from a manufacturing perspective as well as project construction viewpoint. So project sizes are increasing globally. While we saw average project sizes in 2020 really dominated by those that were 10 megawatts and under. 2020, though, was also the year that we saw the most projects between 10 and 100 megawatts of all years. So what we're seeing is, the global average project size, has been rising steadily since 2015, and it's just under 4 megawatts in 2020. But this is, a global scale. So in Asia Pacific, we see much larger projects that will tilt that average higher. And then in Europe and other regions, we see smaller projects. So this is, I think, an interesting trend to pay attention to. But further, and I touched on this earlier briefly, but the hybridization and co-location of floating solar with other generation resources. So, whether it's floating solar paired with hydropower or offshore wind, for example, or even just floating solar paired with storage, I think these are going to be increasingly important trends. And I also think it's important to sort of note the difference between co-location and hybridization, where hybridization is one step further than co-locating. It's a bit more complex as opposed to just two resources sharing a point of interconnection, to where the two generation facilities are actually operating together in the electricity market. So I think both of these will be great drivers for floating solar. I also think, looking at from the perspective of manufacturers, we have started to see a lot of, attention on floating solar. For instance, on the technology side of things, we've seen Hanwha Q cells, for example, and Hyundai, come out with a solar module that they're sort of framing as applicable for floating solar solutions. So maybe we'll see more of this, I think, and especially as we see more manufacturers come onto the scene, and even more developers and EPCs. I think this will drive more growth, more innovation on the technology side of things, for sure. So I think those are some interesting trends.
Wow, Molly. So that's a very interesting, a lot of trends happening. So not only from the technological side, but also from the project development side. So we can expect still a lot of growth and a lot of changes in the floating solar market. And on that note as well, I wanted to end our conversation looking a bit ahead. So looking to the future of floating solar, we still have a lot of questions if floating solar will remain a niche market, or if it's really going to get to be of a more solid market, a solid investment. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see, actually, how do you see the future of floating solar? Do you see really a bright future ahead, or do we have some bumps on the way?
Definitely. I think from our perspective at Wood Mackenzie, we definitely see strong growth ahead for floating solar. There are a few challenges, one of which is just the high system costs, which may still serve as a barrier to entry, especially in certain markets. I think this is particularly crucial in countries that have high labor costs, or where skilled labor is just more difficult to find for these projects. Maybe the balance of system equipment is still more expensive when you compare it to a land-based system, just depending on the project's design requirements. But I do think, as I was talking about before, with the influx of maybe new developers, EPCs, and manufacturers that will kind of get into the floating solar space, that competition will help drive down the costs over the next 5-10 years. And so I think we can expect to see that. So the future of floating solar, though, is quite strong. I mean, we expect floating solar to grow at a faster rate than the total global solar market over the next 5 years. We see, floating solar alone expected to reach about, just under 2 gigawatts of installed capacity in 2021. So that's about 1% of the total global solar installations. But we do expect this share to increase over the next 5 years. Wood Mackenzie estimates that about 15 countries have potential to reach over 100 megawatts of cumulative floating solar capacity over the next 5 years, and over 22 countries, over the next 6 years. So this is quite remarkable, when you compare to, where we were even 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And I do want to note that even though China is still expected to lead the floating solar market just in terms of installed capacity, along with other key markets in the Asia Pac region, like India and South Korea, of course, other markets are going to grow in share of global capacity. So, for example, the emerging markets I mentioned before, Israel, for example, but a lot of European countries that will have prominent share. So thinking about the Netherlands, of course, is the leader in Europe. They'll continue to lead the way through 2026, as Wood Mackenzie estimates. But France, Germany, Spain, Portugal are all expected to increase in share of Europe's floating solar capacity over the next 5 years. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, so the Netherlands is expected to host about 75% of Europe's floating solar capacity in 2021, but its share is going to decline to 53% in 2026. So as these other European markets start to gain traction, we'll start to see the share of the dominant Netherlands kind of fall over time. And then to add to that, Europe's annual installed floating solar capacity in 2026 is expected to be more than triple what it was in 2020 alone. So that's just a sense of what Wood Mackenzie has estimated. The European Commission is promoting 55% decarbonization for 2030. So we see some great, policies and incentives, as well as on the, tender side of things and the financial scheme side of things that could help promote the floating solar market in these European countries.
Oh, that's great news for Europe then, Molly. Very
Definitely.
nice to hear. Well, thank you so much, Molly, for sharing your insights with us today. It was very good to speak with you and to hear all about, the exciting news for the floating solar market. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. A big fan of Solarplaza, and thank you so much again. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Molly. And for all of you watching us at home, so just stay tuned. If you want to know more about this exciting changing market, stay tuned with the Floating Solar Conference that is happening on the 28th of September in Amsterdam. We hope to see you there. Thank you, Molly. Have a very good day.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.